Hi, my name is Noel Toynton and I am looking at the topic of the recent COVID-19 pandemic in Australia. In the second paper, I'm going to explore the philosophical presuppositions underlying the paper Rearranging the Deckchairs While Staring into the Abyss. It's subtitled Some Observations, Predictions, Reflections and Comments. In this meta-paper, I'd like to explore some of my presuppositions underpinning my short paper titled Rearranging the Deckchairs While Staring into the Abyss, where I offer my philosophical perspective on the current COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, and where I proffer my take on what would be a set of policies seeking best practice in view of the various innovations being worked through worldwide. I'm doing this primarily from a philosophical point of view, and this presentation also should be viewed through that same lens. Whilst listening to a recent press briefing of a certain Prime Minister I do not wish to name, I was appalled to hear them say that they had no idea how they were going to get out of this crisis. Admittedly, it would be a foolish person, and there are many who would like to put a date on ending this necessary lockdown, whose advent undoubtedly we must wait and hope would occur as soon as possible. However, how can you adopt any sensible political position and oversee a suitable set of policies if no reasonably planned trajectory is also outlined and taken into account as to how we confront this crisis, effectively deal with this emergency, and then extricate ourselves from its midst? Unfortunately, this observation seems to apply to many so-called world leaders. There is much talk about flattening the curve, this exponential growth in the number of people being infected by this virus, but no clear message as to why we are doing this, and how this measure is but one necessary step on a path to overseeing a relatively successful extrication from this pandemic. As in many things on the political stage, there is all too often a shortage of vision and planning over the longer term. There are a number of ways we can deal with this crisis. Basically, at this moment in time, we only have two approaches. We could either ignore its advent and downplay its import, as exemplified, for example, by President Trump, and in the same vein insist that the governments around the world are doing far too much, or assume that lockdown is the way to go and only argue over the speed, degree and details, along with the ramifications and political economic measures needed to address the consequences of this rather radical and novel way to live and love in this time of plague. Why lockdown? And even more importantly, how do we extricate ourselves from this state of affairs and reanimate our economies? Convenience, let me assume this new way of living our lives has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We're at the beginning of this phase of lockdown. We are not dealing with an epidemic of influenza, but with a pandemic of COVID-19. This is something much worse, and about 15% of infected patients will need some form of hospitalization. Left unchecked, there will be an avalanche of patients who will need urgent medical assistance and who will not be able to receive that care and attention that they would normally have received. In a breakdown of our medical services, many more people will die who would have survived if adequate care were available. Therefore, this urgent imperative to flatten and bend this epidemiological curve downward. In this regard, much could be said for going early and going hard. By flattening and bending this curve downward, we will be taking pressure off our hospitals. According to one set of predictions, if 20% of Australians were to get infected by this virus, then approximately 1 million people would need to be hospitalised, and 1/4 of those would need to take up one more scarce or non-existent bed in ICU. In the midst of this lockdown, testing would need to be ramped up to include all visitors from overseas, medical staff, all patients seeking medical attention at fever clinics attached to hospitals, whether they be fully instituted as such or acting in that manner by default, all people in close contact with suspect or confirmed cases, reconfirmatory tests informing us that infected person has now recovered and so on, and eventually and effectively the multiple testing of the entire population to that extent both relevant and possible. Tests are getting quicker. There is also a supplementary approach with the administering of relatively simple tests for the presence of antibodies formed in an immunological response to this virus, confirming if a patient has been infected with this virus, but not informing us as to whether they were still infectious or not. From such data and from oral histories, etc., both active and passive contacts could be traced, subjected to relevant forms of triage and triated accordingly, and by such means further reducing the spreading of this infection. In an end phase, sources of infection would be progressively removed from the population at large. a population now consisting of both the non-infected and the sufficiently recovered. With such information, the targeted uplifting of this lockdown could then successfully be instituted, hopefully, with our safe return to a civilization as we once knew it. Then, with the dissemination of a successfully tested vaccine, the continually monitored uplifting of this previous lockdown can then be suspended until the advent of the next pandemic. The eightfold formula I proposed in the original paper was total lockdown immediately, testing, tracing, tracking, triage, treatment, retesting, and a promptly targeted removal of communities from lockdown. As you will note, an explicit trajectory is entailed in this formulation. You'll also be aware that a number of arguments have been presented about the so-called health of the economy. Most of those arguments are quite fraudulent and sometimes promoted by vested interests and their political proxies. It is the deontological duty of a society to care for its 6 members properly, adequately and efficiently, i.e. suitably. Yes, the economy will take a severe hit, but if the eventual trajectory of our responses to this event is short, through being both quickly instigated and lifted, then the economy would be less impacted both during this response and in recovering from the shock of this necessary lockdown. On the economic side of the lecture, I would like to offer a few final brief comments. Again, let me restate. A society has the deontological duty to look after all its citizens, along with all guests or visitors, in times of a severe crisis like this COVID-19 pandemic. Just as it is obvious that people without a job will soon have difficulty paying either their rent or mortgages, and should not be evicted from either their rental accommodation or their homes, similarly it does not serve the community to have people evicted from their sources of employment. Then too, investors, banks, people underwriting mortgages, business loans, etc. also need to be protected in some fashion or other. Hence my simple solution where no one is fired, no one is evicted, etc. Basically, this formula has 2 parts, namely, stop financial time for 2 months and suspend all forms of mandatory payment, be that from wages to the payment of rents, etc., and put everyone, say, over the age of 16, on a universal basic wage for 2 months with an adequate amount to comfortably support themselves. In this climate of financial suspension, welfare recipients, for example, could well afford to have their pensions halved. Payments of such a wage would use systems already in place for doing that, namely welfare and wages, etc. By etc., where people fall between these 2 basic institutions of welfare and work, regardless of whether they were citizens or not, they could be quite simply asked to register and supply banking details, perhaps an address if possessed, no questions asked other than, say, their signature or promise that they will receive only one overall payment over that 2-month period. That should be enough time, hopefully, that it would not need to be extended if a thorough lockdown were to be instituted and successfully targeted uplift of that lockdown were already well underway. Some philosophical food for thought. So stay safe and hope our politicians can clearly oversee a quick and successful end to this necessary period of lockdown, etc., perhaps somewhat in the manner as envisaged by myself. Thank you.